we are back to work at the end of this first, and I would say exciting day that we are having at the conference. And it's a real pleasure to have with us Mar Reguant for the keynote lecture this year. So let me say a few words about Mar to introduce her, although I suspect that many of you in the audience already know her. Mar is professor in the Department of Economics at Northwestern University and research fellow at the Barcelona School of Economics. Before that, she was assistant professor at Stanford GSB, and she received her PhD at MIT and the BA at the Autónoma de Barcelona. She has worked extensively on the impact of auction design on environmental regulation and on electricity markets, the impact of carbon trading on energy-intensive industries, and the impact of the energy transition itself and the current energy crisis. On these topics, she has published in, let's say, many top journals, just to mention a few: the American Economic Review, the Journal of the Association of Environmental Resource Economics, European Economic Review, Journal of Political Economy, and the rest. She's the program director of the IO group at CEPR and a research associate at MBR. And among the many things she has been, I would like to also recall her collaboration with Danny Ellerman, who was my predecessor here at FSR Climate. So when I look at your CV, one of the first papers I think was on grandfathering with Danny. And so it's particularly interesting and nice for me to see the way you started and the great career that you're doing. So Mar, I don't want to take more time. I'll leave you the floor and really eager to listen to your presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. It's been great to be here in the morning and to hear the policy discussion, and I'm really glad that I can contribute with the keynote. It's great that you mentioned the paper with Danny Ellerman. We were exploiting a nonlinear rule to instrument the allocation of permits. Unfortunately, the nonlinearity was not very strong, so we never managed to publish that paper, but both Danny and I, or at least myself, we learned a lot from that process. And it's still a cute paper, even though the nonlinearity was not strong enough to kind of make it to a journal. So today I'll be presenting work from two different papers, but before that, I wanted to give a bit of a big picture on renewable expansion. I think renewables are about the only good news that we have on climate, and I guess I wanted to highlight that the good news not only come from the cost side that we are all familiar with, but also with the fact that markets adapt to renewables and are also making the costs of integrating renewables lower. And I will talk about the costs of integrating renewables in two cases, Spain and Chile, where we see that these costs of integrating are there, but might have been lower than we expected. So this slide, I don't need it in this audience, but as you know, we are late. We are very late. And as of now, renewables are kind of the fastest way to at least make some progress. As I was mentioning, there are few good news in the space of climate change, but at least renewables are now cost effective, even if you don't have any environmental motivation. We are also aware that renewables are kind of, again, the most cost-effective technology at the moment, and that because it's providing net zero carbon electricity, it's also opening the way for this electrification that needs to happen, for example, in the transportation sector, which is kind of occurring, but also at a slow pace. And so I wanted to, before getting into the papers, highlight that a lot of my research is now funded with an ERC Consolidator grant that started just last year, and I have it at the Barcelona School of Economics. And with this ERC, we're trying to use mostly electricity markets data to understand how this energy transition is impacting both the supply and the demand side. So the idea of the project is to not only look at how the energy transition is affecting households, but also think about how these changes will interact with the growing uneven impacts of climate change itself, for example, when it comes to temperatures or extreme events. So in the project, the ERC project, we have a lot of work on both the supply and the demand side, as I mentioned. So on the supply side, we look at things like the impacts of renewables, the slow exit of coal, that's a project focused on the United States, the value of transmission expansion. And on the demand side, we focus a lot on the distributional impacts of the transition, the impact of the energy crisis. This obviously was not in the proposal, but it's coming naturally into the work we are doing, as well as the impact of more volatile prices or the impact of solar adoption, depending on which kind of households are adopting, and so on and so forth. Today, I'll talk about the supply side papers, and as I mentioned, I will focus on some of the papers about renewables. So this is the chart that you all have seen, where we see the cost of solar and wind plummeting when compared to alternatives. And nowadays, this graph is even more striking, given the large cost of fossil fuels, particularly in Europe. So we have these costs coming down, but there have been some concerns of how we can incorporate these new technologies into the grid, taking into account that they are very different in nature. They are volatile and intermittent, and we cannot choose when we turn them on. If there is sun, there is solar power. If there is no sun, there isn't solar power. Obviously, batteries here are important, and we also have good news. I should have included the one on batteries. We also have good news on the battery front, but batteries are still kind of in its infancy, I would say, and are still not enough to deal with this intermittent nature of renewables. So I guess what I wanted to highlight with the keynote, and that will be the keynote message, is that innovation has been very important to bring this cost down. The learning by doing that we have seen, and the reduction in costs have been massive, but also has been important in learning about how to integrate renewables into the grid. And some of these bottlenecks that are in the early 2000s or 2010s, early 2010s, might have looked big, thanks to changes to how we operate the grid, how we do things, or how we build physical infrastructure like transmission, are mitigated. And I'll give examples of physical infrastructure, market design, and batteries I will not discuss, but obviously are another way in which, not necessarily strictly the cost of building solar, but the cost of using solar or wind goes down with cheaper and leaner batteries. So here I put some examples, and this is not an exhaustive list, but for example, in Texas, an interconnection with a lot of wind generation, early wind generation. They did very ambitious grid expansions. It's called CRESS, the CRESS expansion. And they also did active changes in how ancillary services are provided to better integrate renewables. California has done many things, but I wanted to highlight the improved market coordination and design. So here we see how markets are helping in California. They have allowed balancing to be provided in the market, in an organized market, by entities that are outside of their traditional market footprint. So California is mostly covered by CAISO, which is the California ISO. And now when it comes to balancing, they allow participants from the whole Western interconnection. That it would include Oregon, Washington State, it would include Colorado, Nevada, and I believe parts of Arizona and New Mexico. So this integration of these additional zones has allowed the reduction of the costs of last-minute imbalances, some of them driven by renewable power. And again, it can be seen as an innovation, an active innovation that has reduced the cost of integrating solar power, mostly solar power, in California. Germany and other parts of Europe as well have increased trading and the frequency of trading to accommodate for renewable volatility. And for example, Germany in the mid-2010s went to half-hour trading. And there could be many things that motivate that change, but a big one was the better integration of renewables. Another thing that can be seen as reducing the costs of wind, not necessarily of building wind, but the overall cost effectiveness of the technology. Today, I'll talk about two projects that do a cost-benefit analysis of the integration of wind power in the case of Spain and the integration of solar power in Chile. So in Spain, I'll highlight some improvements, and in particular, Spain improved the market design as well as the participation of wind resources into frequency regulation that reduced the cost of integrating solar. It reduced, wind. It reduced operational costs. I will provide more detail in a second. And in Chile, I will do a cost-benefit analysis of public efforts to expand the grid. As you know, expanding the grid increases the market size, and it tends to be a good idea if it brings large benefits, but in practice, it's very, very difficult to do. And in Europe in particular, it's very difficult to build big transmission lines. In Chile, I guess they managed to pull off a couple of grid expansions. They are planning some more, and they were very successful at allowing for the better integration of solar resources. So that was my kind of introduction. I'll talk about these two projects just to briefly mention. One is co-authored with Claire Petersen and Lola Segura, and the other one is co-authored with Luis Gonzales and Koshiro. So on to the first paper. This paper is looking at wind integration in Spain. As you may know, Spain went early into building wind power, and already by the early 2010s, it was 20% of generation in Spain and Portugal. What's relevant about Spain and Portugal is that as you know, during this crisis, we are finding out Spain and Portugal are connected to Europe, but there are some limitations to how much you can transmit between the Peninsula Iberica and the rest of Europe. So 20% of wind in an island, that's the Iberian Peninsula, it's quite a large share of wind. So here we assess whether things get harder in days in which there is a lot of wind versus little wind by looking at a time series data of the operational costs and operational details of the electricity market in Spain. Some of the data are restricted to Spain only because they come from Red Eléctrica. Some of the data also include Portugal. They come from OMIE, the market operator there. So the methodology is quite simple. We just do some regression analysis where we exploit changes in wind availability to see how days with a lot of wind or days with little wind impact the costs of the system. And again, the goal is to see whether wind power is having these negative costs by leading to intermittency problems. We then do also a broader cost-benefit analysis of the investments of wind power into the grid. On the cost-benefit, we find that consumers have been better off, even after accounting for the cost of the subsidies. This is intuitive, but at that time it was seen as an expensive policy. We also find that there are some intermittency costs coming from wind, and in days when there is a lot of wind, the operational costs of integrating wind go up, but we do find that they are relatively modest. And we also find evidence that the market design, with its improvements in market design, the cost of integrating wind went down. So yeah, both my papers will be pretty happy papers in that sense, with good news on the costs of integrating renewable power. So as I mentioned, the data come from Red Eléctrica and OMIE. It's about 10 years of time series data. They include market prices, intermittency costs, which we measure as what in Spain is called operational costs. It includes ancillary reserves, congestion costs, and other reliability services. We have data on emissions so that we can quantify the benefits of this increased wind production. And we also have data on the subsidies received by these wind farms. We will quantify the impact of wind on several variables. On the benefit side, we'll have this emission reduction, reduced use of fuels, so we save costs, and price reductions for consumers when we think about consumer surplus only. And then on the cost side, we will measure this increased cost of intermittency, which can in part be paid by consumers and in part be paid by wind farms. This is actually a market design question. Do we want consumers to pay for the cost of intermittency? Do we want the wind farms themselves to pay for this? And then we'll also put on the cost side the price reductions to consumers, because while the consumers are happy about it, the producers might not be as happy about the price reductions. So this is when we split on who wins and who loses. So the approach, as I mentioned, is quite simple, given that wind is quite random. It does provide very nice variation in the X variable so that we can run a regression to measure the impact of wind on these several variables like emissions or prices. To make it a bit more interesting, we will try to differentiate between low wind days and high wind days. So these quintiles refer to days or hours, depending on the regressions, we do it day by day or hour by hour. Hours of low wind would be the first quintile, and the 50th quintile is the hours with the most wind. And we try to see if the effects are different depending on the level of wind. We will differentiate what are the average predicted costs. So at different level of wind, what are the average costs of integrating renewables? And we also will measure the marginal effects. So an additional gigawatt of wind, gigawatt hour of wind, how much is it increasing the costs to the system? So a note on endogeneity, I said this is very easy because wind is exogenous, and it really depends on how you measure wind, whether it's exogenous or not. If it's an objective forecast based on wind speed, I would say we can call it exogenous. If it's some wind forecast provided by the system operator, they might already take into account some of the curtailment actions that they might think of doing. So we use different approaches where we use a wind speed, wind direction, and other variables to try to instrument. But the bottom line is that the results are quite similar. So here, for example, the dependent variable here is the costs of integrating wind. Sorry that I should have written what the Y variable is somewhere in this slide. And we find that whether we use forecasted wind or final wind production, the impacts are similar. This is saying that for each gigawatt hour of wind, the costs of producing are going up by 19 cents per megawatt hour. So this is a very small, relatively small number. For you to get a sense, operational costs are typically in the order of 3 euros per megawatt hour or 2 to 4 euros per megawatt hour, depending on the hour. So this gives you a bit of a sense of maybe 5 to 10% increase in operational costs because of wind increases. However, operational costs, these reliability service costs, are a small part of total costs, and therefore this increase is quite modest. In our sample, by the way, average prices are maybe 30 to 40 euros, which now sounds like insanely low. But yes, prices are in the order of 40 euros. So this is a small contribution. We then look at the different operational costs that we have in the data, so we can separate whether the costs are congestion, balancing, reliability. And then again, we try to ask, do we have higher costs when we have more wind? So this is the costs on average. As I mentioned, they are between 2 to 4 euros per megawatt hour of demand served. So that would add 2 to 4 euros to the final price of electricity. In our data, that would be 5 to 10%. And we can see that they are indeed on average increasing with wind. So this is saying the days that there is a lot of wind, there are more payments for reliability, there are more payments for congestion. So yes, wind is increasing some of the intermittency, and we do see some more reliability. However, the marginal effect is relatively modest, as I was mentioning, particularly if we compare this with the overall cost of energy. It's in the order of 0.1 to 0.2. This is the 0.19 that you could see before per gigawatt hour of extra wind production. So this finding, I think, is important because early on, when wind had to be brought into the grid, there were concerns that it would be very difficult to integrate high levels of wind in these markets. And yet in Spain, there are some hours of the day in which we might have 50, 60, 70% of wind production, and the system seems to have been able to accommodate it without increasing too onerously the cost of reliability. So we decompose these different costs that I was mentioning, and we find that in the context of Spain, and by the way, this is very dependent on each market and how each market deals with these services. But in the case of Spain, we find that the biggest share of the costs and the biggest share of the cost increase is what we call restriction costs. These are costs related to congestion. So as you know, renewables are often given priority in the grid, and this was leading to some congestion that was increasing in the days when wind was more available. We find importantly that these deviation costs, these are last minute departures on production. And we find that deviation costs are completely flat when we look at wind production. This is very interesting, and it goes back to what I was mentioning on market design. In the Spanish market, wind farms are responsible for the cost that they put on the system because of their volatility at the last minute. And therefore, what's paid by consumers, that's not increasing with wind production. Instead, wind profitability is about 5% lower than what it should be because they pay for these deviation costs themselves. So that signal is already incorporated in the cost benefit of the technology. So when we look at prices, during this period, wind had a very dramatic effect on average prices, and it did reduce prices quite a bit. You can see that between days of little wind and days with a lot of wind, by the way, this is ceteris paribus, controlling for everything else that we can control for. You can see that there is a very substantial decline on prices, and it can be about 1 to 2 to 3 euros per gigawatt hour. So it can be quite substantial, as you see at the margin. We also see that there is some increases in this is the blue one is the one that they get, the wind farms get, and you can see that there is a discount on what the wind farms get, but that discount is not becoming terribly worse over time. So these last minute deviations that wind farms are paying for, it is a substantial discount on their profitability, although it grows a little bit over with a lot of production, but it doesn't go too bad, like it doesn't grow too much. So when we do all these regressions, we have these effects of wind, and we try to see, okay, what are the overall effects on consumers, producers, and emission reduction so that we can compare it to the cost of investment. So this is quite a standard cost benefit. I would say the contribution of the paper is to include these operational costs and these deviation costs that are paid by wind farms so that we take into account the cost of intermittency with more detail. So consumers will benefit from a reduced price, and the cost will be that they pay for the subsidies and the cost of intermittency that are paid by consumers. Producer surplus, the benefits to wind farms is the subsidy and reduced fossil fuel costs. On the cost side, there is a reduced price that will hurt both wind farms and traditional producers, and there is the cost of intermittency paid by wind farms. Emission reductions, I don't have to explain this here, but there will be this displacement of a generation. And then for the LCOE, we will look at different costs of investment to see what's the break-even point. So when it comes to consumer surplus, they tend to be very happy that there is wind, and they will be happier the more wind there is. When it comes to non-wind producers, they are definitely not very happy because their market share goes down and prices go down. And when it comes to wind, they are making quite a lot of money, obviously, because they are increasing their production. So this is wind revenue. So to the cost benefit, we need to think, okay, does this wind revenue justify the investment? We do that for different costs of investment. This is 50, 70, and 90 per megawatt hour cost. And these are for different values of the social cost of carbon on the x-axis. And we find that if wind is cheap with a carbon price as low as 30, this investment, everyone's better off, including the consumers are better off, definitely. We already saw it here. But the environmental benefits are enough to compensate for the unhappy producers and the investment costs. If the investment costs are a bit higher, you need a social cost of carbon that's a bit larger. But honestly, in the bigger scheme of things, Even for the worst scenario case, we see social cost of carbon in the order of 110 or 120, that today looks very reasonable. So when I was doing this picture, it made me think that sometimes we try to assess the value of environmental policies by what we think the social cost of carbon is now. For example, back in 2010, we would have used $20 or $30 for the social cost of carbon. And it seems to me we might want to be a bit more conservative with our social cost of carbon and try to use higher social cost of carbon. Because as we are talking before in the policy panel, we keep failing to mitigate, and this social cost of carbon keeps increasing. So this policy, maybe evaluated through the lens of 2010, would have been expensive, but it's clearly now that this was a cheap and welfare-enhancing policy. So before moving into the other paper, I wanted to highlight this aspect that I mentioned on market design. So there are many things that have been tweaked in the Spanish market to better integrate renewables, but I will highlight one example of a policy change that happened in 2014, when the Spanish regulator changed the subsidies to wind farms from production-based to investment-based. So this means that instead of being paid per megawatt hour, they would be paid based on their total megawatts of installed capacity. So in reality, this was kind of a way to remove the subsidy from many wind farms, because the subsidy, with the change of the subsidy, many wind farms did not find it attractive and therefore stopped being subsidized. So this had a big impact on subsidies, as you can see here, but it also had a big impact on market prices. So when there were subsidies, as you may know from Germany, Texas, and other markets, Spain itself, when there are subsidies, it's quite typical to see zero prices. Or in markets without a floor, you might see negative prices. When there is a lot of wind, prices tend to go negative. Well, what happened in Spain is that when prices wanted to go to zero because wind farms had subsidies, there was a lot of congestion that was kind of expensive. So after this policy change, wind farms did not have an incentive to distort their bids anymore. Prices went up, and we find that system operational costs went down. So this is kind of a bit suggestive because it's obviously a time series. It's kind of an event study, but it's suggestive that this policy change was helpful in reducing the costs of integrating wind. So it's fair to mention, however, that consumers were worse off because no longer you had these very low zero prices that actually were benefiting consumers. So this is kind of the first paper, and I wanted to make some broader conclusions from this paper before moving into the other one. So as I mentioned, this early adoption of wind was perceived as expensive, but the gains are positive and growing, even more due to the natural gas crisis now. This wind is extremely cheap in comparison to the alternative. There's been a lot of active innovation in how wind farms operate in Spain and how the market is designed so that it can be better integrated. I gave an example, but there are many others, for example, on how wind farms are contributing to frequency regulation. And I think the same way that learning by doing is hard to predict in many industries, and it was hard to predict for the solar or the wind industry, these innovations in market design and how we better integrate renewables are hard to predict, but we shouldn't maybe underestimate them going forward. For example, as we put batteries, we might come up with new designs that make battery investments more predictive, for example, or more certain. So this is the first paper with some more broader thoughts. I want to talk about the second paper briefly. I think I have about 10 minutes, and then we can open for discussion. So this other paper is, I guess we can think of improving the market as a complement to renewable technologies. Here we can think of physical infrastructure as a complement to renewable technologies. And here, very importantly, it's transmission. So in this paper, we do a cost-benefit analysis of the impacts of a large renewable infrastructure expansion that happened in Chile and that connected to large areas of the country. And importantly, it connected the solar region of Atacama to both the mining regions in the north and the city center of Santiago. So I don't know how many of you know about solar radiation, but the Atacama Desert is kind of unparalleled in its solar potential, even when compared to relatively good solar areas. So it was this resource that was sitting there, and that the Chilean government basically pushed for a big infrastructure project to bring it to the big demand centers. So as you know, existing networks are typically not built for renewables, and we don't have renewables where people are necessarily. Sometimes we do, but it's often the case that we don't. And in the United States, we have the same situation where most wind and solar are in relatively unpopulated areas. So typically, it's often efficient to build a transmission line to bring the better resources into the city centers, even if you combine it with more local renewable power deployments. So in Chile, as I was mentioning, sorry, I have the picture here. This would be the Atacama Desert, bringing it to Santiago. So when we don't have this market integration, when we don't have the transmission lines, basically this shows up as renewables being less good, or renewables being relatively more expensive. For the same amount of investment, you get definitely less out of that resource. One reason is curtailment. So if you have a certain amount of solar power installed, you might not be able to use it. And therefore, for the same investment, you will get less output. So that's already reducing the profitability and the cost efficiency of the technology. Additionally, it can affect investment. So when there is curtailment, it means that there is more power than what's needed. So prices will tend to go to zero. And with zero prices, you don't have any incentives to invest. So not only with the existing investments, we're using them less, but we might also be preventing new investment because it's basically of no use in that area. So we will try to quantify these two channels and see how the expansion in Chile enabled to resolve some of these difficulties. So just on the big picture, as you know, it's really important, the issue of transmission, and it's often a bottleneck. In the case of Europe, transmission has to go through countries, and it has to typically go through very populated areas compared to Chile or the United States. In the United States, it's relatively less densely populated, but transmission lines tend to go through state lines, and it's also kind of a nightmare to build transmission lines. There is a lot of appetite for doing it, but it's difficult to implement. In Chile, as I mentioned, it's basically a poster child of transmission expansion, except China, which, as you know, has done a lot of transmission expansion. But in Chile, they did manage to do a lot of transmission expansions that in other geographies, they can be quite difficult. So we will be exploiting the expansions in 2017 and 2019 in our study. So this is the map before transmission expansion, and you can see this deep blue area. This is the Atacama Desert that was seeing very, very low, close to zero prices. This is where solar power is, and basically at this moment in time, there was already a lot of solar power here that could not go anywhere. The north was a completely separate region, so it was not even connected. And the south, where Santiago is, well, it was at a bottleneck. So there was a transmission line, but it was very small, given the amount of solar power in Atacama. So what the expansion did, the first expansion was connecting Atacama to the mining regions, and the second expansion in 2019 was better connecting Atacama to Santiago. By the way, this is not a finished project, and the Chilean government is already planning the next expansions, because again, this resource is so good that they are planning on building more. So what we do in the paper, we use also hourly data from Chile. It's more of a panel because we have regional data for every region of Chile, but it's basically a time series on the evolution of the Chilean market. And we will evaluate these two events, the interconnection and the reinforcement. So the interconnection is when it connected to the north, the reinforcement is better connecting to Santiago. And I guess the contribution of the paper is to try to combine two methodologies. First, we will do a standard event study, more in the spirit of the project that I was presenting before, a regression where we look at the before and after of this transmission expansion. And then we will complement it with a structural model. In the paper, we go in more detail, but we argue that without the structural model, it would be hard to quantify what are the investment benefits of the transmission line. So we can easily get at what is the impact of transmission at impact, but it might be harder to see what the investment, overall investment effects are. And we do find these are important for the cost benefit. So the data is basically at the hourly and node level. So we have marginal cost, hourly demand, clearing prices, lots of details on the power plants, their electricity generation, and we also have power plant investment data. For example, the construction costs of solar plants. We take all of this data, and the first step that we do is run the event study. We regress the cost of serving the market. This would be per megawatt hour, in dollars per megawatt hour. We regress the cost of every hour of serving the market, and we see whether it goes down with the interconnection and whether it goes down with the reinforcement. Importantly, this is the overall cost of the system. And because these expansions are integrating the market better, you would need a pretty big friction to not find that the costs are going down. Integration should bring the cost down. The question is by how much. So when we run the regression, we find that after interconnection, the costs went down by about $1.72 per megawatt hour during the middle of the day, and about $1 per megawatt hour on average. You can see here the costs of the system are about $36 to $38 per megawatt hour. So these are about a reduction of, let's say, 5% or 3 to 5%. After the reinforcement, there is an additional reduction in costs. So overall, it's about $3 per megawatt hour that get reduced, something like 8% during high demand hours. And in lower demand hours is about more $2 per megawatt hour, or about 5%. So this transmission line reduced the overall cost of the system in 5 to 8%. So this is the static impact. So right at the moment in which they connected the transmission line, trade improved between regions, and cost went down immediately, kind of at impact, in 5 to 8%. However, we don't quantify with that regression what happened to investment. So in the paper, we have some theory that suggests that, yes, we capture the solar investments, but only if they were to happen exactly the day that the transmission line happens. However, in practice, it's not the case that you build the solar panels exactly when the transmission line happens. There could be many reasons for that, but one is that it's hard to predict when you invest in solar. So what we find is that if there is anticipation, then this event study will not fully quantify the impact of the transmission line. In the case of Chile, there was a lot of anticipation, and you can see this red line here. A lot of solar power was built before the transmission line, which is here. So we have all this solar power that was built in Atacama. The green line is the prices in Atacama. Prices were already going to zero. So we had these solar panels earning zero prices for a while until the transmission line hit. So in the paper, we argue that the least part of this investment was probably in anticipation of this transmission line. And therefore, we built tools so that we can say, okay, how much of this increase is thanks to the transmission line, so that we can include it in the cost-benefit analysis. So to do that, we build a structural model. I will not have time to do this. It's a relatively simple model of the electricity market in Chile. The good thing is that we can run this model, and we can do basically a dispatch model of who's going to be producing and why. And the good thing is this allows us to do some counterfactuals. So we will run the market with the transmission line, and we will also run the market without it to see what are the benefits to each technology from different transmission line configurations. So the structural model is a dispatch model. I will not have time to give you the equations. The key to the counterfactuals is profitability. So we will compute for the optimal level of solar panels with and without transmission lines. And this will give us this delta. What are the investment benefits of the transmission line? To give you a number, we find that 70% of the solar panels would not have built unless the transmission line were built. And therefore, there is this big investment benefit coming from the line itself. We then look at the social cost of the line. Remember that to make this happen, the Chilean government made this a public investment that was paid by consumers. So consumers ended up paying about $1.8 thousand million or 1.8 billion. So the question is, were consumers better off or worse off after this integration? So to do that, we see what are the benefits to consumers, which is reduced costs, and we compare that to these 1.8 billions. We calculate what is the estimated time of return. So how many years does it take to recoup the investment? What we find is that if we don't take into account the dynamic benefits, the investment benefits of the line, it will take about 25 years to recover the cost of the line. So you can kind of justify it, but in political cycles, this is a long horizon. However, we find that if you take into account the dynamic benefits, the transmission line pays itself back pretty quickly. So this is what I had. I'm a bit over, but let me do some broader conclusions on this second paper. So another innovation that required from renewable power is the need for large infrastructure projects. And I think a lot of innovation can come from policy. How do we manage to approve these projects? How do we manage to roll them out? It's a difficult coordination problem that even if everything were perfect, also is difficult because it's difficult to allocate who should pay for what share of the transmission line and when. So these publicly funded projects, even if consumer funded, can be cost effective and still bring net consumer surplus. Chile might be the best case scenario for this, but it's kind of, again, a positive case study in which this was executed with quite a bit of success. So these are the two papers that I wanted to share, and I look forward to talking more broadly about renewable integration or any other question that you might have.
Thank you, Mar. Really rich presentation with lots of food for thought. I open up to questions now. I will start from
with the chat, and then I'll continue.
No, I think you can go first.
Okay.
Rosa Maria here from FSR.
Hola, Matt. Bona tarda. Soc de Barcelona.
Wow.
So let me just introduce myself as a complete ignorant on renewable energies. But I wanted to ask you to get out of the domain of the national scale renewable investments and get into the city domain. Because in Barcelona, for instance, now there is all these discussions around energy islands where they are discussing about self-sustainability of electricity through renewables. I'm trying to find spaces in the city that could accommodate solar panels, for instance. And also I know Google has been working quite a lot also with new applications and looking for cities that they wanted to characterize the roofs of their cities in order to apply some of these, I'm talking about solar in particular. But so can I ask you, what are your thoughts? I'm sorry that I'm taking you a bit out of your...
No, that's fine.
Yeah, it's because cities are becoming such a core of the decarbonization process. So what are your thoughts about renewables in cities?
No,
barriers and opportunities.
First of all, these two projects are focused on larger scale projects, so very different animal. So deploying in cities, it is more expensive per megawatt hour, or I guess we might measure it in per kilowatt hour at the city level. But I do think that they are complementary technologies. They are almost different technologies in some sense. Because they interact with the grid very differently. One is at high voltage, one would be at low voltage. I do think it has a lot of potential when it comes to creating energy communities. For example, I have been advocating, and I am an advisor on a project in California to use public schools to put quite a lot of panels. They can provide shade for kids, which is very important, although I hear that sometimes they are concerned about the balls that the kids play with. But to be honest, I think it's still a win. They have a lot of capacity, and in Spain, as you know, the sun there, I mean, it's terrible where these kids are playing, and the temperatures are increasing massively. They also have oftentimes good roofs that you can put solar there. And importantly, they can become an island. If you have the money to put the batteries, and that's a big if you can put the batteries with the public school with quite a lot of solar, if there is a problem in the grid becomes a shelter, becomes a resilient shelter for extreme weather events. I think in Europe, we are a bit spoiled because there are lots of redundancies in the grid. But as you know, California and Texas, or you might not know, but California and Texas have been really struggling with their grid during extreme events. And there have been cases of several deaths because of lack of power. So these resiliency aspects, I don't think they should be underestimated. The other important aspect of pushing small scale projects that are a community project in cities. The other important aspect of this is the equity aspect of solar power. So as of today, I have some work that my team and I are doing. Everyone knows this statistic. It's a matter of quantifying it. Adoption of solar panels is extremely correlated with wealth because you have a house and you can afford to put solar panels. So households that don't have a roof or that might be renting have very limited ways to benefit from these now cheap and affordable technologies. So by going community solar, you can allow for more households to participate in these technologies. And I think it's, again, not something to, we should not diminish the importance of that aspect. And Adrien's paper this morning is kind of a red flag along those lines. Some of his other papers on the yellow vests as well. We have to find a way to include vulnerable households into this transition. What's happening in Texas, for example, is that the very high income households, they have solar panels and they also have batteries. So when the grid goes down, they become their own island and they are protected. And the most vulnerable households are not protected. So I do think they also can fulfill some of those needs. The cost benefit is very different. I do think co-benefits are more important in that case. In the case of larger scale renewables, they are just, as of now, cheap. In the cities, they are also relatively cheap, but these co-benefits can be more innovative, and I think you can think about them in many, many different ways. Yes.
Gracias.
Great, thanks. I open to questions from the virtual audience as well. And I have a question by Whitson, who was asking, could you please explain a bit more about the change in subsidy from wind supply that took place in Spain in 2014, from production to capacity? Is this what this was the change from feed-in premia to feed-in tariffs?
Yes, so they did kind of two changes. They tried to fix it in 2013, but really what made a difference was the 2014 regulation. They basically changed the system in which wind farms were paid. So before, it used to be a subsidy, the market price plus a subsidy. Then they tried to do just a subsidy. And then they tried to do a subsidy based on capacity only. And that's the change in 2014. So the idea is that as long as you could show that you were producing a certain number of hours, maybe it was in the order of, I cannot remember the threshold, maybe 4,000 hours. You had to be operating a minimum number of hours during the year. But as long as you fulfilled that minimum number of hours in operation, you would be paid a fixed number. It would not depend on production. Whereas before, you would only get paid if you were producing. So as we know at the margin, if you subsidize me to produce, then my marginal cost can even become negative, because if I produce, I'm going to get, let's say, 30 euros. So the effective marginal cost of some of these units before the policy change was, let's say, minus 25 or minus 30. And with a policy change, then they became completely detached from the subsidy scheme, and the wind farms started behaving without that distortion, let's say. On top of that, because they didn't have a lot of money, they made the subsidy less attractive. So many wind farms decided not to receive the subsidy at all, and go for the market price.
Okay, we have another question from Eliana, who's asking, well, who's commenting actually on the Spain recent renewables auction, which flopped badly on November 22. The government allocating only 50 megawatts.
So I thought my interpretation was also that the money to be made now is so high that the firms did not want to compete too fiercely because they can get better prices. In some sense, long-term contracts are very high because of the high natural gas prices. So in part, I think the auction didn't succeed because this type of very fierce competition that we have seen in previous auctions, I think it might have been perceived as not needed by the companies themselves. Like solar companies have many other ways in which to deploy projects. So the coordination effect of the auction might have been less valuable than before. Before, renewables were already cost effective, but it was much closer between the market price and renewable cost. Now renewable cost is much lower than market prices. So it's kind of, in some sense, there are many other options in which to move projects forward. This is a bit of a speculation, but if anyone has other thoughts, I would be happy to listen to them. So I don't have a bulletproof argument, but that I think has played a role. The fact that long-term contracts are so expensive now that firms might not want to compete very cheaply on these auctions, which typically get very low prices.
Right. Thanks. I see Teal has his hand up.
Thank you for the presentation. A lot of new insights I got. You addressed the problem of missing infrastructure, missing connections over solar panels to the city centers and so, but isn't that problem also caused by missing market incentives to build transmission lines? For example, in Germany, we have a unique price for all over Germany for the transmission services, independently of the scarcity. And if we had a nodal pricing system, and the providers of the transmission services could charge these prices also higher there where there is the scarcity, then there would be higher incentives to build the necessary transmission lines. I don't know how it is in Chile and Spain, but isn't that also not a market failure, but a policy failure for missing markets?
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's very difficult to trigger private investment in transmission. Even in the US, which is quite permissive of merchant investments, it is a very risky investment oftentimes, and you need to go through so many hurdles that it's very hard. In Chile, my understanding is that fully centralized, and that's not too different from Spain. Transmission is considered a sort of a natural monopoly. So there is a commission that will assess what lines should be built and why. And I guess the secret sauce is to see whether that commission is using a good model to come up with what the best investments should be. That's, I guess, the more centralized natural monopoly view. In Germany, I guess it's 4 companies, but I don't know how they provide incentives to these 4 natural monopolies. I honestly do not know. But yes, I think I wouldn't say that the systems implied by Chile and Spain are equivalent to a per unit price, because they try to come up with what the best lines should be. But it's true that I don't know if to the company they pay the same. I don't know. I really don't know if to the company it's the same. But at least the regulator tries to come up with the best lines in some sort of a process. But I don't know if the company itself benefits particularly if the problem solved is bigger. Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question here from Albert.
Yeah, thank you, Ma, for your presentation. I mean, I'm working on energy communities, and there's also a lot of discussion on what's their benefit. And I mean, the European text, they talk about the cost-benefit analysis of distributed energy resources. And when we think about renewable, we usually think about what their impact on the distribution grid, so at the lower level. And in your research, it seems like you focus more on the, market price, transmission level. So I have a broader view. Is that a choice? Do you think the result will be different if you look at, as Rosa said, also the city level, at the lower grid? And maybe,
yeah, no, it would be a completely different animal. The type of data is also a completely different animal and oftentimes not available. So I have public data on larger scale investments, and I have public data on larger scale transmission costs. I have public data on all of that. But at the distribution level, there are some teams that have detailed feeder level distribution data, but that's much narrower data and typically not directly publicly available. Although in principle, we should be working with these utilities to get the data and understand how it's impacting losses, how it's impacting voltage at the low level, how it's impacting potential frictions. My understanding is that the big problem is if a distribution substation becomes a net emitter instead of a net ask, because they are meant to be asking for energy, not throwing it out there. But it would be interesting to have these micro data. In California, there are some teams that have that detailed data. But in Spain, I don't know if some people have it. I believe Frank Wallach has a project in France where they have some sort of more detailed data, but I don't know if it's as detailed as, for example, the one in California, which is by every feeder. Very, very detailed. It becomes bigger data. I would say I use big data, but it becomes bigger, bigger data. Yeah, but a completely different animal. I don't think what I mentioned today necessarily applies there. Although, as I mentioned, I do think there are some people who believe we should only build at larger scale, but that's not my position. I think we need so much of it that we probably need to use whatever we can and try to find complementarities between these technologies. Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks. If I may, I also have a question concerning your cost-benefit analysis. You mentioned, if I understood correctly, that the Chile government discount rate is 6%. Is that the discount rate that you use in your net present value analysis?
Yes, so they do 5.83%. Yes, and we use that number to come up with the net present value for solar. Yes.
Okay.
Although not quite. So we say with that discount rate capped at 25 years. So are the solar panels recovering the money in 25 years? Yes.
All right. Okay.
Because that's what we assume is the lifetime of the solar panels, basically. Yes.
And another curiosity, if I may say so, it concerns how can I say, the geological structure of Chile, whether this changes, affects the results very much, because the morphological structure of Chile is quite idiosyncratic in some respects. And so I was wondering, how much this may affect the transmission costs or the difficulties to build transmission lines. You were mentioning Atacama connection to Santiago and other places. And I don't know the country enough, but I suspect that this is a peculiar situation.
Yeah, no, I think the political economy there are not as complicated as in many other countries. Also, as an aside, Chile is kind of aligned. So from a network modeling point of view, our model is very simple. And in any other country, it would have to be more complicated because you would have to account for transmission flows. But in our case, it just aligns. So it makes the math very simple. So that's on the more technical part. On the political economy part, so the North had been, my understanding is that the North had been separate from the rest of the country, in part because Atacama is in the middle and there is not much there, but in part because the mining region wanted to protect itself in terms of energy costs by being separate. So in some ways, the solar availability in Atacama got the country united in some ways, because it was right there in the middle between the mining region and Santiago, and they are basically, there are only net winners in this process, because again, very few people live in Atacama. My understanding is that there were some compensations to the people living in Atacama, but because it's a small number of people, the net gains are quite clear. And I guess there was not enough opposition to huge transmission lines, because again, they are going through relatively unpopulated areas. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking of Italy, for instance, which is a vertical country like Chile, but with mountains in between. So, you know, it's much
Oh,
more...
yeah, that's another bottleneck. So, and the political economy to me is the bigger bottleneck. So in Catalonia, we spent like 20 years trying to connect with France or something, and it took maybe even longer than 20 years, and it was 100 kilometers. So maybe I'll tell you an anecdote where innovation and frictions can be important. So I was in China maybe 10 years ago, and I was talking to them about a high voltage direct current project. So direct current has been a big innovation also here, where you can go much further distances. Chile is planning a direct current line for in the next 5 to 10 years. So in China, they were planning a 3,000 kilometer line to bring wind from the west to the east. And I talked to them and I'm like, oh my God, this will take forever. And I was thinking 20, 25 years, you know, and they are like, yes, it will take a long time, 3 years. Okay.
Yes, that's we have different
tempos, yes.
Well, thank you so much. It's a very interesting anecdote, which you know, it's a perfect conclusion, I think, of this story of the paper presented today. I see our time is running out. So if there are no other questions, I will thank you so much for your presentation, and conclude by saying that next time we want to know the demand side, because today you focus on the supply side, but as you somehow mentioned along the way, there are also distributional aspects that are
happy to.
And so I look forward to your further research on these aspects in the near future.
Thank you so much, Simone, and everyone else. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mar, again, and see you soon.
Adeu, Mar.
Adeu.
And so I conclude also the day, and the appointment is for tomorrow morning for the new day and the new session of our conference starting at 10 on emissions trading. So don't miss it. See you tomorrow.